Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Dania Thafer. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum, and we're very pleased to welcome you at this event. We at the Forum and our co-sponsors, the United States Mission to NATO, are pleased to welcome you to a panel discussion on our most recent report that we're launching, Women, Peace, Security, Gulf Perspectives on Integration, Inclusiveness, and Integrity. The ever-changing security landscape of the Gulf, security risks and challenges are, quite prominent and on the rise. And through coordinated efforts that seek to increase gender inclusion in conflict prevention and resolution processes, the Gulf states can address these shared threats and improve collaboration in the security realm. Ensuring full, equal, meaningful participation and representation of women at all stages of peace and security is crucial for the stability, good governance, and gender equity of the Gulf region. There is a growing body of evidence which shows that the meaningful participation of women in peace operations and conflict resolutions, especially in leadership positions, makes for stronger and more effective peace building. Women's efforts in Gulf government institutions, civil society organizations, and the private sector have been substantial in easing the effects of armed conflicts and geopolitical tensions. Throughout this one-year program, with the participation of 27 women experts and practitioners, mostly from the Gulf, the six GCC states, Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. In this program, we delve deeply into the obstacles, opportunities, and best practices for the role of women, peace, and security. Today, we'll discuss the following issues. We'll address factors that continue to limit more meaningful participation of women in the security establishment. We'll address the most effective methods for enhancing participation, both at the grassroots level and by state-driven initiatives. We'll look at how women in peace and security can break the glass ceiling in the national security enterprise, given the fact that it is traditionally the most masculine sector to work in. And we'll investigate how educational curricula and national vision plans can mostly effectively support the integration of women in peace building and security. We will also explore how integrating women into the security sector could be a remedy for gender-based violence. And last, we'll look at how successful integration will look like and the consequences of continued exclusion. Before delving into our discussion, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Ambassador Julianne Smith, the U.S. Permanent Ambassador to NATO, for her welcoming remarks.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the closing event in our joint project with Gulf International Forum. This is the culmination of a series of roundtables that gathered 27 experts, practitioners, and academics to elevate the dialogue on women in international security in the Gulf region. Our partnership with Gulf International Forum will provide concrete suggestions to empower policymakers and opinion leaders to advocate for greater inclusivity in the international security sector. While Gulf states have made efforts towards inclusiveness, there is still a need for capacity building in the region to incorporate gender perspectives and increase women's participation in the security sector. Gulf women are catching up in academia, but they still lag behind their male counterparts in job opportunities, particularly in leadership positions. History, along with a growing body of evidence, shows that the meaningful inclusion of women in peace and security processes leads to more successful peace agreements, promotes stability, and strengthens U.S. national security. The U.S. seeks to advance the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all their diversity across diplomatic and foreign policy engagements. As a woman who has worked in the national security sector for several decades, I can say from experience that when we support women's meaningful participation in decision-making and advance the protection of women and girls, the outcomes are better for everyone. Women are still not represented at parity to men in the international security sector, but we are making progress. In 2017, the United States became the first government in the world to enact comprehensive legislation on the role of women in peace and security. And in 2019, the Department of State released its own strategy to support this very effort. The strategy focuses on supporting women leaders around the world who make contributions to global security, including by ensuring the department and its personnel have the necessary skills and tools to carry out this important mission. We report on our progress under this plan every year. In fiscal year 2021, the Department of State invested approximately $110 million in WPS assistance programming, which includes this project. Within NATO, we work with partners and allies to advance NATO's WPS agenda. NATO's common values of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and obligations under the UN Charter underpin the principle that the full rights and participation of women are essential. The NATO Action Plan on WPS was endorsed by defense ministers in October of last year. It supports the commitment by allies to further advance gender equality and integrate gender perspectives in all that NATO does. Supporting women's meaningful participation to maintain peace, stem conflict, and counterterrorism leads to better security and economic outcomes for communities and countries around the world. As NATO looks to build a more peaceful, inclusive world, we are particularly proud to support this project. I'd like to thank Gulf International Forum, specifically Executive Director Dr. Dania Thafer and Program Director Anas Al-Qaid for their work on this program. Thank you also to the 27 participants from the 9 Gulf states who contributed to the roundtables and the panel. Without your unique insights and dedication to our shared mission, we would not be able to make a meaningful contribution. I wish I could have joined you in person for this event. I hope you will have a fruitful discussion today, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes and recommendations that will help advance our work in women, peace, and security here at NATO and globally.
Dr. Dania, you are muted.
Wow, I've been speaking for quite a while. Okay, so I will start again. So we at the forum are deeply grateful for Ambassador Smith and the rest of the team at the U.S. mission to NATO for co-sponsoring this program. A special thanks to the U.S. mission to NATO's public engagement specialist, Cassandra O'Connor, and also Marie Blanchard. Now We have the pleasure to introduce to you our excellent line of panelists in the order of their speaking, and I will also give the brief introduction with their titles. Should you be interested to learn more about their background, their bios are on our website and also in the invitation email. We will begin with Ambassador Rend Al-Rahim. She's the co-founder and president of Iraq Foundation and former ambassador to the Republic of Iraq to the United States. Our second speaker is Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush, and she's the president of Mid-East Analysts. And our third speaker will be Maali Al-Asousi, the former director of direct aid in Yemen. And our last but not least is Dr. Mira Al-Hussein. She's the non-resident fellow at Gulf International Forum, and she's also a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. So each of our speakers will speak about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Please write your questions early on if you would like us to pose it to the panel. And without further ado, we would like to welcome Ambassador Rend Al-Rahim.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Dania, for organizing this really important initiative. I think I've been part of it at different points in its progress. I'm going to speak about Iraq as quickly as possible. So to start with, we have to recognize that Iraq is in a distinctive position in the region for two reasons. First of all, there's intense scrutiny by the international community, by the diplomatic community on Iraq's domestic affairs. Now, I don't want to call it meddling, but it is scrutiny. In other words, what the government does, what parliament does, really comes under the scrutiny of the international community in a way that it doesn't in other countries in the region. Just to give you an example, there has been a United Nations assistance mission to Iraq since 2004, and it's renewed every year, and it's a very important element in the overall diplomatic community. The second factor which makes Iraq somewhat different, not entirely, but somewhat different, is the intermittent conflict within the country that started in 2004 and culminated in the dismantlement of ISIS in 2017. And these factors have in some ways helped women, in other ways have made the situation of women much worse than in other parts of the region. Let me just begin by ways that these factors have helped. So one of the advantages of diplomatic scrutiny is that Iraq was the first country to adopt a national action plan to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. So the first action plan was adopted in late 2014. And as I said, this was the first country to adopt it. In 2020, Iraq adopted its second national action plan on 1325. And these action plans, particularly the second one, which is much better written and had a great deal of input from women's organizations and NGOs, as well as from the UN and other women-focused organizations, is really quite an elaborate and complex document. Now, having said that, neither NAP1 nor NAP2 has been significantly implemented. And despite the advocacy from women's movement, from the international community and so on, we have barely started implementing any elements of NAP2. And so really we have something good on paper, but it's not in action. I want to give another example before I move on, and that is the constitution that Iraq adopted in 2005. There was a great deal of pressure from women's NGOs, from women advocates and activists, supported by the international community, for Iraq to adopt a 25% quota for women in parliament. And I can tell you that without support of the international community, we would not have been able to do it. So fast forward to the elections of 2021, the Iraqi parliament has seats for women more than its quota. Instead of 25, it has 29% of parliament. Now, the question is, to what extent does this translate into real power, real involvement in national security issues, and so on? And I want to argue that not very much. I mean, to a certain extent, but not enormously. In terms of the conflict, of course, this has been devastating for women. They have borne the brunt of continued conflict in terms of displacement, loss of family members of bereavement, widowhood, and many of them have become suddenly women households who have to defend their families, defend their families as well, a completely unknown situation. How has this affected the security situation? These factors have put a great deal of pressure on the state. The conflict and the fact that women have been extremely subject to, more subject really than the male gender, to the fallout from conflict, has driven the government to more recruitment of women in the police force. This has been significant in the last, I would say, 7 to 8 years, and we have seen it happen that women in the police force are in greater numbers. Another community police. This is not a law enforcement arm of the Ministry of Interior. It is a peacekeeping and conflict mitigation arm. And that has recruited a lot of women, because often women are in the middle of these family situations or community situations that will either give rise to conflict or threaten the peace of the community. On the other hand, on a policy and decision-making level, there really are very few women. So if we're talking about the local, the grassroots that Dr. Dania talked about, there are very few women in community meetings that address reconciliation, peace building, conflict mitigation. This is mostly among local men. Tribal elders, religious leaders, other types of community leaders, plus officials in local government. And then when we come on to the national level, we have political party leaders, parliamentarians, male parliamentarians, senior officials in government positions. They hold their meetings on security, they hold their meetings on reconciliation, on conflict mitigation. There is never a woman present. The voice of women is absent. So, while Iraq has taken some good steps on paper, in practice, women remain outside the male-dominated circles that determine policies and decision-making on security. But if I have a few minutes, I would really like to get away from the notion of security only being related to conflict, to armies, to warfare. This is the traditional view. But really, in recent years, security has become a much more expanded term. And I would like to sort of offer a different take on security, which is ensuring peace, prosperity, and sovereignty of a nation and a people, rather than simply preventing conflict. Security, in this definition, takes on a much wider implications. And today in the international community, we really are, when we talk about security, we talk about food security, we talk about water security, energy security. We've seen issues of energy security in Europe, in Germany, other parts of Europe come into prominence. So security is not only about warfare and armies and the military. There is water security, there's food security. In our region, climate security, desertification, these present security and impact women at least as much as men. And so I would suggest that we need to broaden this concept of security to include that. Now, why do I say that? It's because women are still excluded from this wider issue of security. When we talk about water security in the Arab world, whether at the local or national level, women are absent. If we talk about food security, desertification, I can tell you that in Iraq, desertification, climate change in southern Iraq is a major problem. And it affects women, as I said, at least as much as women. Women in the southern region of the marshes are very active in agriculture, in animal husbandry. They are, and many of them are widows and heads of households, and they are suffering because of desertification and climate change. But does anyone include them at the local level or the national level about discussions of what to do about desertification and water? The answer is no. So this is another path for leadership, for policy making and decision making, which is an important way to participating in an expanded concept of security. So if I have 2 more minutes, I would like to suggest a few approaches. First, at a national and regional level, we need to identify different threats to society and national interests and acknowledge that there are other security threats that impact our societies and our communities other than just military threats and warfare. The other thing that I think is very important is to recognize that security and participation in security issues is not just about combat and muscles. It is increasingly today about brain power. And this is something that is often neglected. So the application of intellect and expertise and knowledge is very important, whether we're talking about security in a military sense or talking about security by other definitions and in other domains. Women can excel at this central contribution or central role for brain power in all sorts of security applications. I can give you that diplomacy is a type of security, and I can tell you in Iraq that women have done very well in the diplomatic field, and also in the Gulf region. We see a lot of ambassadors and so on. So that is the type of brain power contribution to security. In terms of practical measures, I think that we should have more recruitment into leadership positions. This is an obvious thing. In not only in the traditional security level, but really also in other agencies and other venues and sort of environments that include this broader definition of security. Second way, I think it's very important for local women to be much more vocal in their role in all sorts of national institutions. And I think there is a problem, a societal problem. I haven't addressed that, the issue of, male domination of security aspects and the fact that women are seen as unable to lead. That, of course, is a traditional view that ought to be combated, and it can only be combated by women. They have to be much more vocal in their demands. A third way is for women to take on security issues at an academic and professional level. The greater the expertise that women acquire, the greater confidence they have, and the more able they are to assume leadership roles. The I can tell you, for example, in Iraq, in think tanks in Iraq, and now we have many think tanks, women are absent from these think tanks. They are not represented, whether by default or by choice. It's not clear. But women really need to enter into these knowledge-rich and policy-rich environments and platforms, because that's how you get known. If you participate with knowledge, with expertise, with professionalism, then you will establish a platform for yourself. And my final point is, I think, as is widely recognized, the key is not in numbers. Numbers are important because they break taboos. And I can tell you that having at least 25% of women in parliament does not mean they are all excellent women and they have performed enormously well, but they have broken a taboo. It has become commonplace for people in Iraq to see women in parliament. The importance of numbers is that increased recruitment increases the opportunities for a path to leadership. And it is the path to leadership that we must emphasize always in recruiting women to whatever institutions we choose to, specify. And the path to leadership must be a path to policy making and decision making. This is really where we want to get at. We want them to get to policy making and decision making positions in all types of security agencies, whether it is military security, food security, water security, and so on. All of that creates the holistic view of security as I understand it. Thank you very much for indulging me.
Thank you, Ambassador Rend. It certainly brought up some excellent points, and I would agree with you that security is not just looking at military boots on the ground and weapons of mass destruction. And we do emphasize on the importance of non-military, non-masculine aspects of security. And those do include some of the points that you made. Another interesting thing that you mentioned about think tanks in the region, and I've been invited by many, but sometimes I get invitations for really, for example, all my male counterparts in my field get international relations, geopolitics, and then I get invited to women in youth and education, which are very important topics, don't mind you, but they're not my area of specialty. And so it's just interesting that they kind of also pigeonhole women in certain areas with the think tanks in the region. So
can I say just one thing to corroborate? In the parliamentary committees that we have in Iraq, there's a parliamentary committee for women and children. No men ever go into it.
Exactly.
It's only women. Yeah.
Yes. So that's what I say. I mean, all my writings and works are in geopolitics, but I get invited to things that they think that are women topics, exclusively women topics. So that is something that certainly should be resolved. Now I would like to move to our next speaker, Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush. And she will talk about the consequences of continued exclusion of women from the security sector. You're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Thafer, for having me. I want to thank the U.S. NATO mission and the Gulf International Forum for hosting the events that have led to the session today. And I've been asked to speak about the consequences of continued exclusion of women from the security sector and more broadly in peace building and security, or WPS. Now, women's role in security is diverse, as we know, be it as humanitarians, agents in the delivery of state security, or as civil society agents. More often, women are viewed as agents of security in a defined role, often supervised by the state as security, military, or police officers, just to name a few examples. Now, traditionally, women in the Gulf have also played a role in the delivery of humanitarian needs, and that also includes Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. But the role of women as real agents of security, acting as independent agents to alter existing security paradigms, is marginal. Consequently, fewer women are active as major political or military leaders. So what are the consequences of the continued exclusion of women as such? To start with, their gender roles in the security field are not always clearly defined, and they are seen as one of many agents in the delivery of security. As a result, men outnumbering women can dominate the gender debate in the realm of security. Hence, women play a marginal or non-existent role on issues such as war and peace, which I care very much about, and in the formulation of national and regional geopolitical and geostrategic policies. Not surprisingly, as our report points out, compiled by the Gulf International Forum, across the Arab Gulf region, most countries rank 100 and up in the latest Women, Peace, and Security Index. Next, in places experiencing perpetual conflict, women's role in security is less visible or harder to assert, disproportionately affecting women as victims of conflicts, for example, in Yemen or in Iraq, and potentially also leading to female-led anti-government movements, as in the case of Iraq in 2019 and later to some extent in 2021, which, by the way, both countries, I have to add, again, according to our report, are two countries that rank 168th and 166th, respectively, in the latest Women, Peace, and Security Index. Thirdly, in societies in turmoil or transition, such as Iran, lacking meaningful forums to advance a dialogue with the state to promote women's rights in the security arena, protests generally led by women occur more often, with tremendous reverberations around the Gulf region and the Middle East. In the case of Iran, since only women working with the state play a role in advancing security in its most state-dominated definition, an increased polarization also happens between women serving in the state, as in the case, for example, of women serving in the paramilitary Basij or the military forces, and those women not serving in the state, as in the case of women now protesting on the streets to reclaim their safety and redefine the concept of gender security, thus creating wider societal schisms and tensions, as well as social and political movements led by women. Gender sectarianization, therefore, happens, perpetrated by the state and its policies of exclusion of women who do not subscribe to state-led security policies or state-dictated forms of nationalism. Not surprisingly, Iran ranked 125th in the latest Women, Peace, and Security Index for 2021-2022. Finally, in the worst-case scenarios, women serve as proxies or non-state actors fighting to build new security structures to replace existing ones led by states. That is, when they are excluded, as in the case of women joining radical terrorist groups in recent years in the Middle East and in the Gulf region. In this case, gender sectarianism of a different type emerges, in which women are not only used as tools by terrorists, but also play a role as sectarian agents in advancing a certain radical Islamic ideology in which gender then plays a role. So what needs to be done? I believe humbly that women must receive platforms to advance an independent dialogue with the state as to the type of security role they wish to play in society. The most immediate platform is a civil society state dialogue in which women represent organized civil society groups active on issues related to human, climate, and state security. In the absence or ineffectiveness of such platforms and similar ones, women in the GCC, Iran, Iraq, and Yemen will fail to emerge as leaders in conflict mitigation. Consequently, societal schisms could potentially remain unaddressed when it comes to transforming into modern and peaceful countries, which in and by itself is dangerous in a region prone to conflicts. And I want to add here that while the GCC states are far less prone to conflict than places like Iran, Iraq, or Yemen, it is not the case that the region is immune to the spillover effects of conflicts that occur in the periphery of the GCC. I want to end, if I may, by reading a poem by the modernist Iranian poet Sohrab Sepehri. And I want to add how pleased I am and how grateful to have a voice here in this forum as an American and as an Iranian woman, hoping to an extent to represent a voice for Iran and its brilliant future. Now, this poem is a timely one, mindful of the modernization drives taking place in many GCC countries, as well as across the Gulf region, and which expands, needless to say, the public space for women, especially as the security arena in all these states localizes in favor of building indigenous capacities. Sepehri wrote, جای مردان سیاست بنشانید درخت که هوا تازه شود. In place of men in politics, plant trees because the air freshens. To offer a feminist version of international and political affairs, those trees, in my mind, represent the women of the GCC region and Iran, Iraq, and Yemen, who one by one can become agents of change by integrating into the security and peace fields through top-down, state-led feminist policies, but also through strong civil societies shaping at the grassroots levels from the bottom up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Banafsheh, for the intriguing poem, and it fits greatly. We should probably add it to the report within our topic, and also for highlighting the importance of both a grassroots efforts for engaging women in security and peace building, along with a state-led effort. I think collaboration with both parties can be hugely beneficial. And now I would like to segue to our third speaker, which is Maali Al-Asousi, and she will discuss the most effective ways for enhancing a participation, both at the grassroots level and from a state-led perspective. Maali has a lot of experience on the ground, actually, in Yemen, which is kind of a unique set of experiences. So we would love to hear from you, Maali.
Thank you, Dania, and thank you for the Gulf International Forum and the U.S. mission to NATO for this invitation and for their great effort in highlighting the gaps which cannot be discovered unless there is intensive investigation, research, and studies, roundtables, which you already accomplished. And thank you for all the speakers and the attendees of this panel. First of all, I would like to talk about the gaps in the society. Then I will discuss the effective methods of enhancing the participation of activism and state initiatives. It was noticed at the beginning of 2000 that the Yemeni society began to have a desire for societal development through local organization and individual initiatives. The openness to society, to the outside world, as well as international program granted and supported by mainly foreign embassies and international organizations, supported this development. The desire developed and matured until the youth revolution occurred in 2011, and then current civil war occurred, and it took now about 8 years, and it's continued. The revolution and the civil war causes a lot of gaps in the Yemeni society, and I will focus only on two gaps. The first gap is the migration of a lot of activists and society influencer to other Arab states, Europe and US. Those people who have very good education experience in the society established great initiatives which developed the Yemeni society in different fields. And they used to have a lot of power and acceptance in the society when it comes to people and also the state, but not necessarily the party of conflict, which is are in power now. Those people left a huge gap in the society when they left, especially when it comes to grassroots initiatives, local and states. The second gap, the UN bodies, international initiatives, and international organizations played an important role in empowering grassroots activists, individuals, and in state initiatives, which lead to society improvement and development in different sectors such as education, health, peace building, economy, security, and so on. However, since the beginning of the civil war, most of the embassies were closed, and which lead also to closing a lot of programs and projects which related to grassroots the development, empowerment, civil society initiatives, and state initiatives. Nowadays, unfortunately, most of the international organizations, the UN bodies, and the international initiative focus mainly on the humanitarian aid, forgetting to empower the grassroots activists, individuals, and state initiatives to elevate and develop the Yemeni society. Hello?
Hello?
You can hear me?
Yes. Okay. So you're finished, right?
No. Now we will talk about the effective method of enhancing participating of grassroots activism and state-driven initiative. First of all, the first level is the responsibility of the international community to highlight and fund programs related to awareness and engagement of party of conflict and to understand the importance of engaging civil society and the participation of individuals and the state initiatives. Without the approval of the party of conflict, the grassroots and activists cannot move on. Because from my experience here and a lot of international and local organizations, that any programs or activities that you implement on ground without the approval of the state or the political, the conflict, the party of conflict, will be either the individual will be suffering or going to jail, or we have a lot of examples of international organization which was shut down by the political party, and also local organization were actually closed. The second level, we have the engagement of the people who actually left Yemen and who have very good experience, the influencer and the activists who live overseas, because as they are the think tank of Yemen. We have a saying in Arabic that أهل مكة أدرى بشعابها, which means people of Mecca knows their ways better. Also engaging international expert to have joint program to empower individuals and state initiatives. Without either or all the levels, without the approval of the political, the conflict party, none of those programs can be implemented. So we have to have two levels of awareness and empowerment. The first one will be from top to bottom, and the other one from bottom to top. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maali, for your insights and emphasizing on the very important point that it should be both from top to bottom and bottom to top. It's something important, especially in the region where there's a lot of authority at the top. We would like to move on to our fourth speaker, Dr. Mira Al-Hussein. She could talk to us, if you could talk to us a little bit about what successful integration of women in the security sector would look like. Mira?
Thank you, Dr. Thafer, and thank you, U.S. Mission to NATO, for this invitation. My introduction is going to be very brief and concise. I think one of the biggest barriers to women's meaningful inclusion has got to do with how much weight we give to women's mere visibility in the Gulf. Many states have contended with appointing women to leadership positions as a means to deflect international scrutiny and score on gender parity rankings. These states tend to receive much praise for such window dressing. More often than not, women in positions of power, be they in security or elsewhere, are merely spokespersons of the state. Their contribution to decision-making processes remains unknown. I wish to paraphrase, in fact, one of the prominent Omani lawyers, female Omani lawyers. She once said something very, very interesting and poignant. She said, "How can we expect a woman who is battered at home to be sitting as an equal partner at the table of peace and security?" Just like Ambassador Al-Rahim had aptly said, we need to not only broaden the definition of security, but adapt it to different contexts. The real question, I would say, is where in the hierarchy of security priorities are we in the Gulf? Have we managed to overcome issues relating to personal security that will allow us as women to consider other aspects of security, particularly national security, and the possibility for women to make meaningful contributions that reflect their gendered input? I often wonder, can women be proactive about injecting themselves in these domains? It's quite hard to say because their exclusion is not determined by educational attainment nor visibility. Women cannot simply work hard enough to be recognized and rewarded with a position of power. In the Gulf, women's inclusion is determined by their acquiescence to the state and its official narrative, and their ability to serve the state's mission as vanguards of cultural security, rather than actual security and peace building and conversations around sort of changing the narrative and the vocabulary of security. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mira, for those very interesting points. And I do see your point specifically about women being spokespersons. In general, with the way the governments are structured in the Gulf, it could be argued also, and maybe you could give me some more insights from your perspective, that men are also spokespersons of the state because of the very limited political maneuverability. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Men, too, are spokespersons of the state, but when it comes to decision making, they're the ones present behind the scenes making decisions, whereas women are excluded. They're the soft power of the state, the soft power, public-facing image of the state that beautifies the message. It could be a message about let's purchase, these fighter jets and go bomb this country, but it's nicer when it's said by a woman. It sounds less malignant, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So I just wanted to underscore this point. So now we're actually going into the Q&A session. I already started with a question for Dr. Mira. We did have a question that was actually directed to Ambassador Rend, which is, and it goes back to, I think, the points that Mira aptly pointed to, which is what about security at home for women? And I think in our report, we discussed a little bit about the exclusion of women from security, local security sector, how that affects also the femicide and issues of security for women at a personal level within the Gulf countries. And also this is a global issue as well, but we're talking about the Gulf countries here. Ambassador?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. Of course, in a presentation of 10 minutes, it's difficult to go into details. But so I'm glad to have this question. At the local level, and we have, because Iraq has been so beset by conflict, that the level of violence in society has become very high. And this violence is not just violence against an adversary like ISIS and so on, but it's really social violence and violence that affects people within their families. We have had a great number of honor killings in Iraq. Probably, I don't know how it compares to the region, but I have no doubt that it is much higher. We have had a lot of not just honor killings, but killings of women in horrible ways, burnings and so on, because women are suspected of not wanting to marry their cousin and so on. And of course, women are bartered on we still have a tribal culture, a revival of a tribal culture, I should say, which accepts the bartering of women to settle scores between tribes. So at the very local level, the personal security of women in the home is abysmal. Now, in what way does this connect with women's leadership? To the extent that we have women's leadership on security issues, GBV in general happens to be one of their main portfolios. They talk about security. GBV is always central to security. But the problem is that very few local women get involved in these advocacy meetings, advocacy dialogues, and so on about GBV. Local women who are themselves the victimized or are survivors of violence don't get a voice in how to make their environment and their homes much more secure. It is usually activists, prominent women, and including, by the way, women in the political arena who make this advocacy, who run these advocacy campaigns. It is really important to include, as I think one of our CEO speakers said, local women at the grassroots level into the conversation about their own personal security. So this is something that really needs, I think needs to be highlighted, and hopefully it'll find its way to your report.
Thank you, Ambassador. So GBV is gender-based violence, for those of you who don't know the acronym. And I think an important point to highlight that is also sometimes missing in the discussion, especially from the Western perspective, is how kind of tribalistic perspectives and masculinity is interpreted in the Gulf region. And of course, there's variation from country to country, because we're talking about 9 countries here. And I think that was one of the hardest parts of writing this report, is to talk about 9 countries in one report. But I would like to hear from if any of you would like to address that. How do you think the perspectives on tribalism affect the role of women in security?
If I may say something here?
Sure, yes, go ahead.
In the context of Iran, what is often missing in the gender debate and the role of women in politics is the rural voices of women. It is a heavily urbanized debate inside Iran, because most of the women advancing this dialogue come from heavily populated urban areas with higher levels of education. surprisingly or not surprisingly, gender patterns of development are almost at opposite ends of the spectrum between the urban and rural populations of Iran. And in the rural populations, while I wouldn't necessarily call it tribal, because the concept of tribe might be somewhat different in the Arab world than it is in Iran, but definitely I will call it rural. The lack of education is very dominant. Poverty is very dominant. Child bride phenomena due to poverty is extremely dominant. We're talking about over 90% of women failing to complete even mid-level education and getting married underage due to poverty. Now, it may not be a barter, but it is still something that is going against the UN Convention of Women, which grants women the right to choose, for example, their spouse. I don't know what that means for Iran's gender development and the role of women in politics in general, because no one has really studied the opposite impacts of gender development in the rural versus the urban sectors of Iran. But I wanted to highlight this because I think it's important that we think about it.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador.
Yeah, I'm not against tribes per se, but tribal culture is hostile to women. It's a male-dominated culture, but it's not just that. It also relies on subjugation. It's an intensely hierarchical structure, and the women are at the very bottom. And I think that this tribal culture is both reflective of and supportive of political domination. And I speak for Iraq. I don't know about any other country. Tribalism had sort of died out in Iraq in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, and then was revived again. And now it's very powerful. And the more law, even as an alternative to the law courts, to the courts of law, women will be subjected and will not be able to flourish. Simple as that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Another point that I think is important to discuss is the role of education and women in the field of security. I can probably speak more about the GCC than I can about the rest of the Gulf region. We know that for sure in the GCC that women have very impressive rates of education compared to men. At one point in Kuwait, men actually had lower thresholds for GPAs to get into universities than women. And so it shows how well women are doing in education, but it's not necessarily reflected in the workforce and in top positions. This goes into the design of curricula and other issues as well. And I wanted to hear some perspectives from Dr. Mira, because I know that you focus a lot on education in your work, and wanted to hear some insights from you about the issue.
I think education is perceived as a pathway to financial security for women. So they've been very active about it, proactive about it, more than men, because men, for the longest period, assumed that they would get a public sector job just by virtue of being men and by graduating from high school and maybe not even working hard enough. But for women, this was sort of like a means for personal security. So as in the future, should things go wrong, or whether they get married or not, they would rather have this security, this certificate that would allow them to join the job market. With time, education became just a tool of standing out, I would say. I mean, there's really no pathway, not even via education, for women to attain positions of power. I remember interviewing students and asking them, this is in the UAE, and asking them, what do you want to be when you complete your degree? And many of them said, we'd like to be diplomats or ministers. And the visibility of women in these two areas kind of lent women this hope and this aspiration that this was actually attainable. But the truth is, I would say this is not exactly, there's no direct way of becoming a diplomat or a minister in the UAE for women or men, really.
Thank you, Dr. Mira. Maali, I know you discussed in your previous points with us about the role of, and this is something Dr. Banafsheh brought up, the role of rural women versus urban women. And there were some points made about how the different groups advocate and play a role for the security interests of women. Could you talk a little bit about your experience in Yemen in that regard?
Regarding women, I mentioned previously in our round table discussion that we have different, let's say, categories or areas where women live. We have people who live in rural area, and they do have a different roles when it comes to security, when it comes to peace building, when it comes to economy, when it comes to education. So it depends on their education and also the rules in the society and the tribals and the head of sheikhs and all this. Each woman, let's say, each level of women have a different rules, but all of them are participating in society. All of them are doing their let's say, they're trying to give to the society when it comes to economy, when it comes to even sometimes when people go to jail, they become like negotiator. When people go to war, they become like negotiator. It depends, of course, on the education and the power that is giving to the women in the whether in rural or in semi-city or in the cities. So it depends on each level, but all of them are having impact, positive impact in different levels. I can't hear you.
I'm muted, yes. This is my issue with online events. I'm always muting myself. I wonder if men mute themselves in online events. I'm just kidding. Bad joke. But anyways, thank you. Yeah, and the difference in roles of women from the rural areas, or for example, in the GCC, there's always a concern of like, and I've read some works about the role of, for example, Bedouin women having opportunities, at least historically, to get involved in higher level positions, because many of them did not have the opportunity to study abroad, like a lot of the daughters of business elite families, who their male guardians were much more liberal and allowed them to travel and learn more and engage the international community. And that also affects the level of representation when it comes to these different positions. So we do have a question from the audience that was brought by Ibrahim, and he asks, how will this trend and the insecurity that ensues would affect women? And he's talking about the future of climate fluctuations. I know this is actually a very old area of security that actually that now is finally getting headlines, but it's kind of getting more attention now, and people are discussing how climate change can affect societies in different ways. And a good question is, how can it affect women?
I've done some work on climate change, specifically on sand and dust storms, and more recently on climate migration in the Gulf region, in the GCC states and Iran. There's no gender-specific debate about it yet, and no gender-specific studies that I have seen today that are ones that I can rely on for qualitative or quantitative research. Let's put it that way. So while we do know that some level of migration is occurring, for example, due to sand and dust storms, the numbers are not even clear across gender in the GCC states, not very much so. So I would say it's an evolving field of study, but that's only the limit of my understanding of the issue. Others might be able to say more about it.
Would anyone else like to chime in on this question? Okay, Mira.
I just have one comment to make, which is the fact that I'm really pleased that a male is very interested in a conversation on women, peace, and security. I mean, it would have been nice really to have a male panelist too, because more often than not, they're the ones making decisions on behalf of women. So maybe if their presence can kind of create that empathy and compassion and desire to kind of include women and change the situation on the ground, not just with regards to climate, but everything else. Gender climate.
Yes, Ambassador. You're muted, Ambassador.
Thank you. So I think I mentioned earlier about the effect of climate in southern Iraq. The area of the marshes is a heavily agricultural area with animal husbandry and other types of agriculture, rice, grain, and so on. And at the same time, rural and semi-rural women who live there many of them have become heads of households because of the conflicts that Iraq has gone through and so on. And these women have been disproportionately impacted by climate change because the marshes are drying out because of desertification, and areas that are not drying out are becoming very saline because the Gulf waters are moving upwards, northwards. So the freshwater lakes of the marshes are now too salty for proper agriculture, and cattle are dying. So this is in the south where women are impacted. Another area where women, and this is based on some studies that are done in Iraq, where women are very impacted by climate change and the absence of water, is in the sort of central eastern part of Iraq, in Diyala province, for example, which again used to be heavily agricultural, and women were engaged in agriculture and beekeeping and vegetable and fruit planting. And because of the shortage of water, a lot of these farms and these orchards are dying out. And again, Diyala is unfortunately one of the provinces which has been impacted by ISIS, and before that by Al-Qaeda very heavily. So we have a lot of women heads of households who have to provide for their families, and we have a lot of internally displaced families that are headed by women. And the water shortage and the climate change in those eastern, central and northeastern provinces that border on Iran have been heavily impacted by this. And nobody has actually measured the impact, we just know that women have been very affected by these. It's very early days, really, and not enough research has gone into sort of gender disaggregation. It's just anecdotal and so on that we know about. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have one question here, and it is, at a time of conflict, we see an increase of community solidarity, mainly among women, and in most cases involving their security and its broader concept. Do you think women have a stronger position to take a role in security at times of conflict, or in post-conflict government or peace-building processes? Big, long question.
Women need opportunities. If they're given the opportunity, they can take it on. But the opportunities to date have been limited. In the case of Iran, which, as we know, is going through a lot at the moment with women at the forefront, it's a gradual process. And if women have played a role in security, it's been pushed forward by the men, and often within a state security context. Women studying security, even in academia, is also a very relatively new thing. 10 years ago, I could count the number of women in this field with just one or two. And now we have about 10. We have about 10 more, 20, 30 emerging ones inside Iran. So I think that even if opportunities happen, women should still have a way to go before they're able to seize them, at least in the case of conflict-prone countries like Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Banafsheh. So we're heading towards the end of this discussion, and I would like to give an opportunity to each one of our speakers to a minute or two to kind of highlight any points they wanted to push forward that might have come up throughout our discussion, or they didn't have opportunity to say during their remarks. I'll go ahead and start with Maali.
Thank you again, Dania. The most important thing that I would like to highlight in Yemen, that yes, women are involved in society now and development in different levels of, like, for example, rural and semi-cities and cities. However, we don't have a lot of support from the international community to let women be engaged on the development, or give them the tools and education of the know-how, how to develop their society and elevate the poverty and a lot of those fields. So it is very important that the international community focus their grant and their fund to support women to be more engaged in peace building and also in security. Because as of now, people cannot be involved in such, women or men, in Yemen without the support from the international community and without the approval of all political party of conflict. So it is very important to empower women and also the society in those fields to be involved and to have impact in their society.
Thank you, Maali. If we can go ahead to Dr. Banafsheh.
Sure. I want to say something in gratitude to men. In the case of Iran again, women have changed the culture of its men. And it is changing very rapidly. And we are seeing large lines of men, long lines, lining up to support the women's cause for equal rights and for development and for women's role in politics inside Iran. So that goes to say that women are capable of elevating the so-called masculine culture within our societies. And even before the recent protests, I have met many men, both in Iran and abroad, who have always encouraged me personally and helped me to advance. So I think that if women are to play a more prominent role in security, we cannot exclude men at all. In fact, they will be our partners moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Banafsheh. This goes into the point that Dr. Mira said about including a man in this conversation. The way we wrote the program was really a dialogue for women, but I agree they are an important equation, of course, in the matter of the integration of women in security and peace building. And certainly, although we talk a lot about patriarchy and masculine interpretations of security, there are plenty of men within the region that have been very supportive of women. And actually, there's sometimes women who uphold patriarchy and hold back other women. So we shouldn't be very very critical also just of our male counterparts, if you will, but also, you know, it's a society-wide issue that should be addressed. Um, and I think Dr. Mira, she's trying to log back in, but we'll go ahead and give Ambassador Rend an opportunity to give her last couple of perspectives.
Yes, I mean, I do want to endorse the idea that men should be partners and are partners and so on. But I really do think that this is a woman's task. And one of the things that I have noticed, for example, in Iraq, there's been a real mushrooming of think tanks on Iraq, political think tanks and various others, and they all only have men, and sometimes very mediocre men. They write papers. Sometimes these papers are really bad. And yet there are no women. I am convinced that women can do much better than some of these mediocre. It would be very interesting to see a women's think tank, a women-led think tank in Iraq or in the region. And when I say women-led, I know Dr. Dania is leading the Gulf International Forum, but I mean really a think tank made up of women, not just women led as one person, but made up of women that can do serious research, serious writing on a variety of subjects that affect the broad spectrum of security. I think this would be a really interesting venture, and I think it would attract attract attention to the capabilities of women and perhaps give them more empowerment and leadership.
Thank you, Ambassador. Being here in Washington, D.C., you know, and the think tank scene, I will tell you, it's still very male dominated in many regards. And actually, until recently, there's become a culture here in Washington that challenges the idea of just having manels all the time. That's something I would say happened in the last couple of years. Not believe it or not. And so it's certainly something that has become taboo just to have all male panels. But I will say also from the perspective of someone that has been running a think tank and having all kinds of programs, I will tell you we send quadruple the amount of invitations to get a woman speaker than we do to get men. Men usually use the invitation, and right away they say, "Okay, I'm coming and I'm on board." And it could be the culture of men being used to being on these platforms. Also, you know, as a woman, I can say childbearing roles of women are very intense. Someone with a new little one, and it's harder to get away, just because of the nature of the job, to be able to come out and be flexible at every speaking event or conference.
But you've just touched on a very important point, which is the willingness of women and the readiness of women. And I think this is what we need to elevate. This is why I said, we need women to develop expertise, professionalism, write papers, engage in think tanks, because this is a path to leadership. And you talk about DC having mostly male-dominated think tanks. Well, in Iraq, there are 0 women. There are umpteen think tanks in Iraq. There are 0 women fellows in those think tanks. I would rather see a think tank made up of women to which men are invited.
Yes, and this goes, I think, to the discussion about quotas and having a certain amount of women and representation, and targeted recruitment of women in positions as well. I think, because men have also been so long in these areas of work and this particular discipline, there's a level of, there's so many seasoned males out there in this field, and not enough seasoned females as yourself in the field to engage in these issues. And so there's a little bit of discomfort for many reasons. And I know we discussed it a little bit in the report, not really the think tank role as much, since think tanks don't, at least I think in Iraq, you're saying there's definitely a proliferation of a lot of think tanks. And there are think tanks in the GCC as well. But, think tanks don't play as strong as a role, I think, in the GCC as they do here in the West. I mean, think tanks are a big part of policy here in the West. And the Gulf, I find them to play a little bit of a different role. I still think they're important, but in a different way. And we didn't discuss that as much in the report. But we also discussed about giving women different sort of benefit packages that is conducive to allowing them also to be able to participate in these types of positions that can be sometimes demanding as well. Mira, Dr. Mira, we're glad that you joined us. Do you have any last points you would like to make before we go ahead and end our session?
Thank you very much, Dr. Thafer. My connection is very weak, but I just wanted to thank you again for the invitation. And I'm so happy to be able to speak with an amazing lineup of panelists. Thank you all too. I've learned a lot from you.
Thank you very much for joining us, and actually thank you all for your perspectives today. I find them intellectually stimulating and very rich, and we might incorporate some of them back into the report, because you gave some new perspectives as well. And we're always looking for the input and insights of women from the region. This was just scratching the surface, really. There's so much more. I mean, I can write about each country, probably very long a report, 10 times the size of this one, and still not address the issue fully. Again, this couldn't have been done without the insights of our 27 different scholars and practitioners from the region. And also the input from our partners, the U.S. mission to NATO. And we appreciate everyone's efforts, even at the forum, who helped us put together the perspectives, took notes, consolidated different ideas, and tried to connect them from different women across the region. I'm really appreciative to everyone in their efforts of this. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope this will be one of many conversations on this very important issue.
Thank you.